Before I get to the speakers, I do want to mention they're going to be talking about the USCTs. When we think of USCTs, the United States Colored Troops, the Black Union soldiers, we may think of the movie Glory, very emotional, impactful film. Some of us may be aware of their involvement in the Battle of the Crater in Petersburg, or that they won 14 medals of honor at the Battle of Newmarket Heights, which is just not even 10 miles from here, and a little southeast of the city. But if you're like me, you are not aware that some of these USCTs settled in Richmond after the war and are now laid to rest in East End cemeteries. And I'm sure that's why most of you are here, to learn more about that story. And to tell that story, I'm very happy, and I would like you to help welcome with me to have here Erin and Brian Palmer. So please, Erin and Brian, give them a big round of applause. Come on up and tell us their story.
Wow. Thank you, Charlie. Can you hear me without the microphone?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so Erin will probably use the microphone. I'll probably just use my voice phone. Thank you for having us, Hamel and American Civil War Museum, and thank you for coming out when you could be watching snowboarding, which we can see from here. We are, Brian and Erin, we are members of the Friends of East End Cemetery. So we're the all-volunteer, members of the all-volunteer cemetery restoration group that's working out at East End Cemetery, historic African-American burial ground. We pitch in at Evergreen too, but our primary effort is at East End. And we'll give you a little bit more information about that cemetery, but first I want to introduce us. So in addition to doing that work, in our free time we're freelance journalists. So this work has absorbed a tremendous amount of our time, and it's sort of, it's become our work, it's become our passion. But it all actually started with the slides are controlled up there. Everything, our interest in cemeteries, is it not going, Sean?
Not just on MTV, but
Try the, and now for my interpretive dance. Can you help them out there? Try clicking. Yes, okay. So, everything, our move to Virginia from Brooklyn, New York, everyone's heard me do my New York accent, but in 2013, our interest in cemeteries, our interest in hidden Black American and American history, they started with Matt Palmer, who is my great-grandfather, only one great-grandfather who served as a private with Company G of 115th USCT. I knew nothing about him. Very few people in my family knew anything about him, but we learned of the existence of this picture on a wall in a family church. I didn't even know that family church existed in Williamsburg. And everything started with a couple of pictures, but this one in particular of my great-grandfather. Next slide, yeah. So, Camp Perry, who knows what Camp Perry is here? All the archaeologists. So, secret military, CIA stuff. But my great-grandfather Matt is buried there. When I realized that he was buried there, I realized that I could visit. So my initial interest was in the spooky spy CIA stuff, but when we actually visited the place in 2012, something else happened. A couple of things happened. Well, first, I was surprised at the condition of the cemetery. It was raked, but wasn't in super great condition. And I had something to compare it to. There was a Confederate cemetery not too far away in the base. Not a Confederate cemetery, but it was a white community cemetery. My family and about 200 other families were displaced from this land in order to create Camp Perry. So my initial response was anger, and then the interest in Matt Palmer really started to blossom. So this idea that, damn, why is it that an African-American site so important is neglected? And yet also, I mean, that was the state of his headstone. How many years ago was that? 6 years ago. And yet, there is my family history. I knew nothing about him. Erin had done some research. We learned, we assumed that he had been enslaved, just given his age. The dates were a little wonky, as you historians of this period know. The dates don't always match up. But it triggered something in me, and I think it triggered something different for you.
Well, for you it might have been anger. For me it was more curiosity about who this person was, where did he come from. Brian didn't know anything about where this family had come from, aside from somewhere in Virginia. So this sort of launched us on a quest to find Matt Palmer, to find his wife, Julia Fox Palmer, and it led us eventually to to Matt's Union Army pension. And I can't even, oh, sorry, you go.
So we have talked to more experienced people, archivists, historians, and they said, you got to see if Matt Palmer has a union pension application. And they warned us. They said, some are fat with lots of stuff in it, affidavits and all this wonderful material, and some are slim. Matt's turned out to be slim and about 36 pages, but full pages of like a muster roll, which as you all know has almost no information on it, but it can be helpful, but with different names, which freaked me out, because I'm a journalist, and I'm thinking like, okay, I need to find Matt Palmer, I need to find that name, and then everything will be all right, but there are all these different names, Nat Parrell, Nat Parham. The archivists at the National Archives are like, dude, it's not showing up. And then, but they said, you need to talk to this guy named Reginald Washington. So, has anyone worked with him before? He's since retired, but I called him 36 hours later, he's like, here it is. And he was able to reconcile Nat Powell, Matt Palmer, all those people with Matt Palmer.
So, I mean, while the record was sort of disappointingly thin, it did contain some really essential information that we wouldn't have been able to find elsewhere. And that was, well, confirmation that Matt Palmer had in fact been enslaved. And then you see very clearly here, were you a slave? Yes. And if so, list your former owners. And we were lucky that his former owner happened to have a very particular name, Maven Hobson.
Not John Smith.
Right, because as I'm sure you also know, if you're looking for Williams and Harrises and Johnsons and Browns, it can be really, really tricky. So this was a kind of a slightly miraculous. And then in Goochland County. So anyway, we have since visited Maven Hobson's home and continue to learn bits and pieces about Matt Palmer, and yet the record still remains very, very thin for him. And much of that is due to the fact that he could not read or write, and as far as we know, never did learn to read and write.
So, and as you know, trying to find information about African American folks before 1865 or even before 1870 can be really difficult if they were enslaved folks. I mean, people were legally considered property, but folks were also black folks were also to be controlled. So the idea that if you can document your own story, right, if you can tell your own history, that's dangerous. So that was prevented, I think, if not at all costs, then at many costs. So what we found about Matt, these like revelatory fragments, and this connection to the USCT, which to us was absolutely super wonderful and powerful, and it got us interested in learning more, not just about Matt, but also about the USCT. Like, we did not know, I knew a little bit, but Sean was mentioning, 179,000 African American men serving the Army, about 19,000 serving the Navy, about a quarter of a million women, men, children helping the Union war effort in various ways, contrabands. I'd taken black history in college, but I'd learned maybe that much of all this story, and to come upon this as a middle-aged person was really kind of a lot, but also really, really wonderful. So,
Brian,
yes,
what is USCT?
United States Colored Troops. So that was the segregated arm of the United States Army, commanded by white officers, but soldiered by African American men.
Four of whom are
yes.
buried. Four of whom we know to be buried at Easton and Evergreen Cemeteries. There are likely more. We do not have records for Easton Cemetery.
Right.
We don't know if they exist. There are records for Evergreen, and they're being treated at the moment at the Library of Virginia, so we're hoping within a short period of time that we'll be able to dig into those, and who knows what we might find. But for now, we know of at least four, and one of them is William I. Johnson, and we actually came to who is buried at Easton. That's his headstone, his wife and his grandson. We came to him sort of not really by way of the USCT or by any sort of military records, but by the WPA and slave narratives. And we kind of found our way to him because we were looking for a proxy for Matt Palmer. Since Matt Palmer's record was so thin, it's how else can we maybe imagine his story? What else can we learn about him? So I mean, it was learning, of course, reading all sorts of books around, about the Civil War, about slavery, about anything that could give us a sense of context, but then also these particulars of somebody's life. And here is William I. Johnson, and I mean, and his story is really kind of remarkable.
Well,
Brian can
so
tell you more.
Erin mentioned there were four United States Colored Troops that we know of buried at East End and Evergreen. 76 acres, only a portion of that have been reclaimed. So there could very well be many, many more. That's just who we know about. As Erin was saying, we were trying to find anything that would give us a sense of what the experience for my great-grandfather, Matt Palmer, a private in the USCT, might have been like. So we have these little fragments from the pension application, but nothing that brings the man to life. His words, we don't have his words, so we looked at all the sources Evan was talking about, including finding our way to the Works Progress Administration slave narratives. That's where we found William I. Johnson. 6 precious pages of a man who was also enslaved in Goochland County, like my great-grandfather Matt, who also walked away from enslavement and served in the Union Army, and who also lived in Richmond. So not a perfect match. William I. Johnson became quite wealthy. My great-grandfather was just a plain old farmer, but he also managed to pass land on to his 12 children, his 12 living children. But William we were able to get a sense of who the man was. So I can read a brief excerpt. I don't have progressives, so I have to do this. He said, yes.
He was also, he had become a prominent building contractor here in Richmond. And I mean, he provided this narrative in 1937. So a year before he died, at the time he was 97 years old.
Yes.
So you can imagine the life that he lived, born in slavery in Albemarle County in 1840. And then he was given I think when one master died, the family was broken up, and he ended up in Goochland County, and then eventually in the Union Army and to Richmond. So it's sort of, and then from then on was active in some of the fraternal organizations that we see evidence of throughout at the cemeteries
And we should say, so ages ago we found these 6 precious pages of his words. We have been working at Easton Cemetery for quite a while, so we had this transcript almost of this interview, and it didn't occur to us, okay, the guy lived in Richmond. It didn't occur to us to look to see where he had been buried. Easton Cemetery. We had been volunteering, cleaning up, and doing all sorts of stuff for about a year before we thought to look for the gravesite of this guy who's kind of like my great-grandfather. We've been ignoring his headstone because it had already been cleared off. So it was, he wasn't quite dead to us. He is humble, understated, and you just get a sense of this man that, as Erin said, the life that he lived. So he said, I didn't know what the war was all about, nor why they were fighting, but when the rebels were out on the battlefield, a few pickets were left to guard the prisoners, and the servants got a chance to talk to the Yankee prisoners. They explained to us about slavery and freedom. They told us, if you got a chance to steal away from camp and got over on the Yankee side, we would be free. They said, if we win, all you colored folks will be free, but if the rebels win, you will always be slaves. Those words got into our head. We got together, 5 of us, and decided to take the chance one night, and we made it. They got up and walked. So, and that, the historians will know that the WPA slave narratives have some issues around them, but the ones gathered and collected in Virginia were quite reliable because the interviewers were African American. They were not the descendants of the slave owners interviewing the formerly enslaved people in Alabama and various places. So this is a picture, oh, that was a picture of William I Thompson. Yes.
That's the only one we've been able to find.
Is that actually him?
Yes.
It's actually him,
yes,
yeah.
This is a picture from the Norfolk Journal and Guide, so that accompanied his obituary. So that's the best we've been able to do, but it at least gives you a kind of a sense of who he was. Because there is something about seeing a photograph that's so remarkable, right? Because so rarely do we actually find images of the people. I mean,
Yes.
we've at this point, you know, that we've been working at East End and Evergreen, we've uncovered hundreds and hundreds of headstones, and we do whatever research that we can. And occasionally we find photographs, and we've met descendants, and some of them have been able to provide photographs, but it's still really rare. So to see the images is sort of
Arresting.
So,
Yeah.
so this was in the Norfolk paper?
This is in the Journal and
Yeah.
Guide, yes. I mean, he has an obituary in the Richmond Planet, which was a larger obituary, but there was no photo. And so this one from the Journal and Guide in 1938.
Henry Wheaton. So this is, I guess, First Sergeant Wheaton was the first USCT that we knew of, right? Buried at Evergreen Cemetery.
And he's the only one that we know of who actually has the military, the veterans
Yeah.
headstone.
That's the only one we've.
That's the only one.
Yeah.
There could be another one. Who
Yeah.
knows? You know, there are many, many acres that remain completely
Yes.
engulfed in vegetation, particularly at Evergreen. So you never know what we might find. But at the moment, this one is the only one we're aware of.
And if you look at the condition of that area, I mean, his family plot has been semi-cleared several times, but this is just a few months ago. So the whole area has never truly been cleared, and it always needs maintenance. And these are safe.
And we actually uncovered the second headstone,
Yes.
the smaller headstone for Henry Wheaton, which has his birth date, and it's Brian's birthday. So that was a total coincidence.
Total coincidence. So the unit. We'll do just brief unit history. He served with the 62nd United States Colored Infantry, which was first organized in 1864 as the first Missouri Colored Infantry. They served in a lot of places, but their greatest, historians, please feel free to differ, but the greatest claim to fame that we know of is that they were involved in the last action of the Civil War. Some people call it a battle, other people call it a skirmish because Robert E. Lee had already surrendered, but there was a scrap, and 62nd was involved, and they mustered out in 1866 from Texas.
So you'll see this is a Missouri regiment. Henry Wheaton was born near Lynchburg in 1842, but was taken west with his mother and ended up in Missouri and then later in Kansas. But he mustered in at St. Louis.
And this
mustered out in Texas.
This image is actually, this is a photo that I took in 2015 in Washington, D.C. There was a reenactment of the Grand Review, which was the great parade of Civil War soldiers after the end of the war. African American soldiers were not allowed to participate. So this was a restaging of that in a more inclusive kind of way. And was really it was a lovely day. Yeah, so this is an illustration from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, African American troops digging trenches in 1864. So this is where the 62nd was, and they would serve a year later. But it's just amazing to dig through Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper and to see all that stuff there. I mean, there's some amazing resources.
So here's a page from Henry Wheaton's pension file. So we mentioned that we had tracked down Brian's great-grandfather's pension file, which was sort of disappointingly thin, despite containing some really essential information. But of course, we've been hoping for the fat file, and we'd heard that there were these things. But so we trekked up to the National Archives a few weeks ago to see whether we could find anything more on these soldiers we know to be buried in our cemeteries, and we were kind of stunned to be given fat files
We were
for
expecting,
all three of them, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we had really low expectations. We thought, well, maybe we'll be able to find a few key details. But instead, we're given these thick folders. So, I mean, we've only really begun to scratch the surface. There's a ton more.
It's mind-blowing.
So much more research that can be done. But, I mean, here's a page from his. Each one of these contains personal testimonies, that they themselves gave, that family members gave, that their widows gave. It contains just a wealth of detail about their lives, even prior to their enlistment, their time in the Army, and of course how they contracted their various ailments. Of course, they're all applying for pensions. They're working very hard to prove that they did in fact develop rheumatism, at Vicksburg in 1863, or whatever the case may be. So I mean, they were clearly, they were really put through the ringer. I mean, these are, I don't know how many pages were these files,
my God.
but I mean, again and again forced to sort of prove that they had in fact not only served, but also then were worthy of a pension.
And the variety of documents is just amazing, and the variety of voices. So these are affidavits from comrades in arms, from co-workers, from commanding officers in one case. Wives, ex-wives, everything we don't have from my great-grandfather is in these files. Which is beautiful, because, I mean, not from my great-grandfather's perspective, but this is Richmond history. It's assembling all of these amazing, beautiful pieces.
And there are many more USCT buried in the National Cemetery, for instance, right on, what is that, Williamsburg Road?
Yeah.
But I mean, so who knows how much more information we could dig into. But for example, in Henry Wheaton's pension file, I'm not giving the signal very well. We discovered that he worked, for instance, for many, many years at the Exchange Hotel, which was on 14th and Franklin Streets. So I'm not sure whether he mentions it, but they interviewed, whoever the pension commissioner, what was he called? The
Pension commissioner, yeah.
pension commissioner, who sought out colleagues to try to see who in fact was Henry Wheaton. Had you in fact worked with him? Had he complained? Yes, he in fact had complained for 17 years of pains and knees, etc. So this is a theme that recurs in all of these pension files. So anyway, that was just a postcard view of the Exchange and Ballard hotels. Yes, this is Henry Wheaton's wife, Harriet Wheaton, who died in 1930. And she actually then received a pension as well. So there is also the widow's pension for her.
Just the information. So you see the fraternal organizations. I mean, listed at the bottom of the headstone. These headstones out at East End and Evergreen. We've said it before. We'll say it again. But these are their texts. We find out so much about fraternal organizations, churches, relationships among people, just by looking at these individual texts in this outdoor archive.
So this is from the Elks, right? So many of the people we see buried at the cemeteries were members of the various lodges. the Elks, the Masons, the Oddfellows, Knights of I mean, the
Right.
list sort of goes on and on. That's a whole other huge project that somebody could do to investigate a lot of these fraternal orders. And then we have,
Yes.
and then this is amazing,
This is,
because this is a letter actually written by Henry Wheaton himself that's in his pension application. And I mean, as far as we can tell, when he enlisted in the Army, he couldn't write, because he signed with his mark, just an X, and somebody else had written his name. And then so here, though, in 1913, he's writing a letter. It's not perfectly punctuated, and yet here it is, and he
His own
signs his
hand.
name himself on all of these documents, which is truly astonishing to see. And that's really because
the commanding officer of
part of the reason. We can attribute
part of the reason,
partly to,
part of it is because he applied himself and studied, but the commanding officer of the 62nd, Lieutenant Colonel Branson, was kind of a hard ass, and he felt that his soldiers should not be playing cards, they should not be hanging out and doing things, they should be learning to read so that they can be citizens and contribute to society. So paternalistic, but in a good way. So I just all of this connective tissue comes out in these documents. It's amazing.
Yeah, and I mean, to see something written in their own hands,
Yes.
that's always really kind of remarkable, because of course we only dream of having that for some of the people in our family, and we likely will never find it. So this was exciting.
So we talk about having our minds blown. This was the first thing that showed up in Henry Williams' fact pension file at the National Archives. We have so few pictures of anybody.
Right.
We have no pictures of my great-grandmother. She was a woman. She did not serve in the Army. She could not have. So there's almost no paper trail. We know nothing about Julia Fox. So we have very low expectations in general. And then to have this image, this carte de visite, kind of fly out of this folder. That's Henry Williams.
And Henry Williams is buried at Easton. Now, we haven't found his headstone, so we're always a little bit skeptical when we find death certificates, and in this case, another researcher had found a death certificate and said, there's a USCT buried at East End, but until we find a headstone, we often feel we can't say with absolute certainty that he is in fact there, because there was often a lot of confusion, too, between East End and Evergreen, so you'll see we find death certificates where it says someone's buried at Evergreen, but no, they're not. They're here at East End, or vice versa. Plus, East End was originally known as Greenwood, so well into the 20th century, people are still calling it Greenwood. So you can imagine with Greenwood, Evergreen, there's a lot of confusion. But in his file, in addition to finding this amazing photograph, a portrait of him late in life, there is a letter from his sister-in-law who was applying for reimbursement for his burial expenses. And she says, I buried him next to his brother in Greenwood Cemetery. And in what section? Of course, we don't have a map, we don't have records, so we don't know. But we think we know the plot. But I don't think there's a headstone, so we may never find one.
But it's that confirmation from within the pension file that, okay, chances are he is there. I mean, the person who buried him says, that's where I buried him. So kind of a shot knocked beyond. So he served with 51st U.S. Colored Infantry, and the back of the envelope history, they were organized as the 1st Mississippi Infantry of African descent. They have a very long unit service history, but they were part of the occupation of Mobile, and then along with many of the African American troops of the 25th Corps, they were sent down to Texas. They mustered out in Texas as well in 1866. My great-grandfather also mustered out in Texas and served in the Department of the Gulf, along with like 16,000 other black troops. So a lot of African American troops served in that theater in that area.
So we mentioned that in each of these pension applications, we found information about their lives prior to enlistment. And Henry Williams himself describes his owner. He talks about he says he was stolen from his owner in Virginia and taken to Kentucky and then eventually to Mississippi. His sister remembers things slightly differently, but nonetheless, she says he was sold at a young age and eventually ended up in Mississippi. And he names his owner, as does she. So it was Benjamin Green, and he lived on Rose Lawn Plantation in Henrico County, right by the University of Richmond, as far as I can tell. And yeah, this is all fairly new to me. But, you know, so looking for slave schedules, we have B.W. Green, and he was in fact Benjamin W. Green. He was only one of them. And, you know, anyway, just to start drawing the connections to Richmond. It's just amazing to be able to place people where they were before the war. Because often, as Brian said, they don't, they often don't emerge in the written records until 1870, you know, at least not with full names. So that was that. What's also really fascinating in his file and in some of the others is that, you know, it's not just the soldier who emerges as a person, but their families, their wives, and particularly the wives, because often they outlived the soldiers and were applying for pensions themselves, applying for those benefits. And the most astonishing is, I think, Henry Williams's first wife, Adeline Ball Williams, whom he deserted in the 1860s, so shortly after the war. And they hadn't seen each other apparently in, 50 some years or more. But she manages to assemble everything that she needs to prove that she was in fact his wife. And they were legally married in 1864 in Vicksburg, I think 1863 or 4 in Vicksburg. And there is a record of this. And then she was able to establish with a lawyer and other family members and other acquaintances providing testimony what she needed to get the pension, and she got it, you know. So however many decades after he deserted her, she still benefited finally, you know. So she provides us this wonderful, wonderful testimony of her life, where she was born, LaGrange Plantation, which we found, it's just north of Vicksburg, or was north of Vicksburg, and also then describes how she essentially she moved with the Union Army, and she washed and ironed for, and she remembers the captain's name, and he was in fact the captain, Peter Carl Kalberg, I think, of this particular unit. So we read a lot about the contraband of war, right? All of these African Americans who emancipated themselves by fleeing to Union lines. And so she was one of them. You know, this is one of the many stories we hear of African Americans then who served the Army in other capacities, right? Playing a really essential role. So it was really wonderful to read her story.
And, you know, the approach generally is so often like mine documents like these for heroes, like we're looking for the highest ranking person or whatever. I mean, Henry Williams was a playa and was not really a great guy, and yet Adeline emerges, and all of these people and all of this information and all of this connective tissue. Like, we don't really need the heroes. I mean, heroes are great, but the information about these regular people, these ordinary people, and the people who were greater than them in their lives is just really amazing. We get to Coleman Smith, who was a private in Company D, 20th century, since 20th, 27th, United States Colored Infantry. This is his hand on a document in his pension application. So, just again, the kind of thumbnail history of the 27th, organized in Ohio, Camp Delaware, 1864. They have a very long unit history as well. They were at the Wilderness. They served at the siege of Petersburg and Richmond, and I believe that they were actually part of that explosion at the crater, the occupation of Raleigh, and they actually mustered out in North Carolina where they were serving. This picture is another one from the Grand Review, that lovely day in Washington, D.C. A couple of years ago. And this is the unit standard regimental colors of the 27th USCT. Photo courtesy, you can't really see it, of the Ohio History Connection. They wanted us to make sure you know that. But their actual unit flag, it's kind of messed up, but it still exists in some form. This is the flag behind which they marched. Kind of amazing. And also, we were able to find a picture of their camp in the vicinity of Petersburg. So this is the 27th camp. Again, like, we are so new to this project, and we're just pulling fragments of information. It will definitely become a community project, because this is how we are contributing to the restoration of this chapter of Richmond history. All of these images and anecdotes, but also these wonderful fragments coming together to tell the story of these people.
And Coleman Smith is also, I mean, his file was also huge, and it contains just a wealth of testimonies that he provided himself and that family members did as well. And he describes also where he, first developed. He's filing a pension for frozen feet, so for frostbitten feet, and it was in fact in January 1865 near Chaffin's Farm. I think that he was apparently, on guard duty and was outside for a very long time and suffered from frostbite and ended up in the hospital in Fort Monroe. And what's sort of amazing is, well, not sort of amazing, what is amazing, that there are actual letters, too, from him to his first wife, Martha Virginia Smith, who lived in Ohio at the time. They are not in his hand as far as, because he even, in one of the letters, he describes that he's going to apply himself to study so that he can learn to read and write. And they're all in different handwritings that have been dictated at some point to people some of whom can spell well and others who can't so well, but nonetheless, he was able to provide these, documents, and they reached his wife. So that's pretty lovely to see. And then this is his second wife, Nanny A. Robinson Smith, who is apparently also buried at Evergreen Cemetery. We didn't mention Coleman Smith is also buried at Evergreen Cemetery, but we haven't found him yet. So we found one of his sons, but so far we believe another son is buried at Evergreen, as are at least Nanny and possibly his first wife as well, Martha Virginia. So this was provided by Creed Taylor, who's a descendant of Coleman Smith, and we've been in touch with that family. We have not been able to track down descendants of the other soldiers, but it's pretty, but we're working on it. So, right.
Just read it. So just a really amazing way to discover someone's status is this letter.
So this is one of the documents that he provided, right, to either for an increase in pension or just to get the pension in the first place. And it's what we noticed first was that it's on the Mechanics Savings Bank letterhead, which for us is significant because many of our people buried at the cemeteries were on the board it was founded by John Mitchell Jr., of course the editor of the Richmond Planet, who's buried at Evergreen Cemetery. But the vice president was H.F. Jonathan, who's buried at East End. And then there are any number of other people who are, we feel they're sort of our people because they're buried at the cemeteries. And so they're names that we see again and again and references in the Planet because they were all pretty prominent Richmonders at the time. Yes, but this is Coleman Smith writing to how he knows his age, because he would have had to prove his age. So he says, in the year of 1838, my father was a contractor on the James River and Kanawha Canal. A big blast was put off there at the same time in June 1838, and 2 engineers were standing within 4 feet of my father, making an estimate of the blast. At the same time, 2 men were trying to lift up a big stone to put in a cart. The stone seemed very heavy, and after several attempts, they failed. They went off and left the stone. After the men had gone, I commenced to work after the stone and finally succeeded in putting it into the cart. The engineers, turning to my father, said, "How old is that boy?" My father said he was 12 years old in April, and from that until now, I have kept track of my own age, which I don't know, something I can't read now, would make me 82 years of age this coming April, or 81 years and a fraction up to the time my papers were filed. This is dated in 1908. So since this time, this is how he tracks his age, which is, and we of course come across in all sorts of other documents how people estimate their age, right? They were born, but in one case was, I was always told I was born during the big snow, or, at a particular battle, or it was right after Lincoln was assassinated, or, there were all these kind of clues.
So Erin was mentioning the letterhead was from the Mechanics Savings Bank. The notary public was an officer of the bank, but so many of these gentlemen, William Costello, John Mitchell, H.F. Jonathan, they're buried at Easton or Evergreen Cemeteries. These were some of the most prominent members of the Richmond community, the African American community here in Richmond. The Richmond Planet was their paper. And even as Jim Crow was being born, African Americans were still creating their institutions, churches, banks, fraternal organizations, churches, I always say churches. And as we were saying, we can see those connections through the headstones at the cemetery. And we can sort of begin to understand the connections because you actually get to see, there are X many people from First Baptist Church, and we're growing that list. There are X many people from Second Baptist. There are X many people who were employees of Philip Morris, whose colleagues donated a headstone. But around the same time, folks will know that other things were going on. So the 1901-1902 all-white Constitutional Convention was the point at which pretty much the final nail was put into the coffin of African American male voting rights. So about 90% of African American men and roughly half of white men were disfranchised. This was the third of three major legislative pushes. The first was in 1884, the Anderson-McCormick Act, Walton Act, and then the institution of literacy tests and poll taxes in this Constitution.
I mean, we bring this up mostly because people always ask us how, about the cemeteries. You see the condition of the cemeteries. The overgrowth. How did this happen? How did they get this way? And more and more, we feel that they can't be examined in a vacuum, right? I mean, they have to be considered in context. They can only be understood in this context. They were established during segregation. Evergreen founded in 1891, Easton in 1897, and it was right at this time, then, of course, that rights that African Americans had won were being stripped away systematically by a white power structure determined to reassert itself during this period, right? And so there was a series of, whether it be laws, customs, or violence.
And you can't understand how the cemeteries came to be, as Erin was saying, without understanding the mechanics of Jim Crow. If someone takes the vote away from you, you cannot direct resources to your community, right? You can't elect the people that serve you, and resources go to other places, like Hollywood Cemetery, like Confederate monuments, like Confederate graves. East End, Evergreen got none of that. So you had this legislative onslaught, and then of course you had the threat of violence. Folks will say, well, Virginia was the least lynchingest of states in the South. That's yeah. I mean, 100 people between the 1880s and 1955. That's terrorism, right? That's domestic terror. So the threat of violence hovering over the lives of Coleman, Smith, Henry Williams, Henry Wheaton, all these folks, in addition to the legal onslaught, the Klan operating, and there's a front page article in the Times Dispatch in 1922 about how the Klan came to a screening of Birth of the Nation and everybody applauded. That's 1922 on the cover of the Richmond Times Dispatch. That was the atmosphere that this community was still fighting to persevere and to thrive. So we jumped the gun a little bit. This is a picture from Easton Cemetery recently. So April 2017, we've cleared, with the help of about 7,000 volunteers, or 7,000 volunteer visits, about 4.5 acres of 16 acres, which is a pretty amazing achievement. There's a lot more to do, and love to see some of you folks out there. We have some of our regular volunteers and our Easton Cemetery folks here. But you know, we see, and we're wrapping up here. For the first year and a half that I went out to East End, I did not have Erin's attitude. I would pull vines and I would go home feeling awful, because I thought, we will never get this place clear. How could it get into negative Nancy? All I could see was the tragedy. I was just enmeshed in that tragedy. And then something shifted. Something Erin discovered immediately. Every headstone that we find is a victory. Every single headstone. We're adding to this narrative. She's found over 900 now. I found about 30. and not 3,000 or 30,000, but 30. But now I genuinely see opportunity, which is why, I mean, we keep doing this. The opportunity is amazing. The teeniest little squirt is on the front lines of history, of the reclamation of history, when she goes out there and contributes to the finding of a headstone. That happens every Saturday around 9 or 10 a.m. So I think that was a little bit more than a half hour, but thank you. Oh yeah, one more slide too. Yeah, that's the.
Brian, why don't you tell how many names you got to put up on the grave?
Oh goodness. So all volunteers have found probably about 6,000 burial sites. About 2,900 have been marked. So we've put about 2,900 names up on findagrave.com. Since 2013. Yeah. Many of those coming from right
That's
over
at
here.
East End, and then of course at
Just at
Evergreen.
East End,
And the
yeah.
East End Cemetery is
Yeah.
16 acres.
Yeah.
Evergreen Cemetery is 60 acres.
60.
So we estimate at East End that there are 17,000 burials. This is a rough, again, we don't have records, so it's a rough estimate. And yes, and there are many unmarked graves. And some of that they may never have had a marker, or the marker has deteriorated to the point that it's no longer legible. But at Evergreen, then, I think at the moment there are over 9,000 records on Find a Grave. Many of those have not yet been photographed, and usually it means if there's no photo, the headstone hasn't been found yet. There's now Evergreen was recently purchased by a nonprofit, so there is a kind of pretty robust, well-funded cleanup effort happening at Evergreen.
Yes. We fund our own.
Which is good. So we're hoping that Coleman Smith's grave will be
Yes.
found soon, right? And some of his children and wives.
Yes.
My question is, what is the pension that these courageous and persevering USCTs fought for, and how does it compare to a regular old Union soldier's pension, and what did the wives get?
So,
Actually,
Erin has those numbers.
Go ahead, but you talk first.
My great-grandfather was denied a pension, but I think after 1912 probably got a pension because the laws changed. But I don't know the exact amount.
How did the law change that made them?
Does anyone know the new May 11, 1912 pension law? I think made the application requirements less onerous, right? And if you reach the age of 62, you were eligible for a pension. Historians, help me out here. Yes? check that one, but yeah, I think that's the case. But I don't know the exact amount.
But here in 1930, and this was in April 1930, shortly before her death later that year, Harriet Wheaton, so Henry Wheaton's widow, was given a raise, essentially. Her pension was raised from $30 a month to $40 a month. But that would have been a fairly significant amount in 1930. And Adeline Williams, so Henry Williams' widow, was given a lump sum, and I think it was the first, I don't know how many payments, of almost $1,800. You know, so this was a woman who was at the time destitute as well, because she and her family had been flooded out during the Mississippi flood, the Great Flood of 1927. They've been living in Greenville, Mississippi. So they find themselves uprooted. You know, this is after, you know, pretty eventful life, right? You know, having followed the Union Army, you know, having been survived slavery, and then the Union Army, and then to sort of, you know, to live her life. And then at the end of her life, or fairly close to it, to be uprooted yet again. So they end up in Vicksburg, but really, and then you find letters in this file pleading for assistance, because they have, you know, they've lost everything. So to get $1,800, and her granddaughter, who she lives with, describes that they're hoping to be able to use, if they get something, they hope to use it to buy a small place to live. So we don't know what happened, but hoping
But
that
they got the money.
maybe she got the money.
Yeah, they
So,
got the money.
you know, so that was.
Yes, Tim?
Brian, Erin, I just want to thank you guys also for an absolutely engaging talk. You guys are an incredible team. It's absolutely great. So I have two questions. One's maybe innocuous, one's maybe controversial. But the first one is: has there been any headway or effort to find descendants of these four men that, and some of the ones that are buried?
She is the descendant finder.
Well, I end up doing a lot of the research on it. I go down I disappear into Ancestry.com, you know. And actually it was John Shuck who coordinates the East End cleanup effort, who found his way to a descendant, or the wife of a descendant of Coleman Smith. And so then I contacted her again maybe about a month ago to see whether, you know, to say, we're going to be giving this presentation, would you be willing to share any stories, or are there photographs, or, but they hadn't yet seen, the family had not yet gotten the pension application. So as soon as we got it, I started sending documents, you know, and so since then we've been corresponding, but they're the only people we've been able to connect with. As far as I know, Henry Wheaton, well, Henry and Harriet Wheaton had 3 children, 2 of whom died early, because they were already, they're described in the pension app, they were dead by the time the pension application was submitted. And then their other son is buried in the same plot, but as far as I know, he didn't have children. He also sort of died, it seems he died at Central State Hospital. I don't know of what cause, so, but, you know, we're not sure.
Yeah.
So anyway, so, and as for the Williamses, I haven't gotten past, like, the grandchild, you know.
Yeah.
The line has stopped for me, so, but we would love to continue to search.
Yeah.
Oh, and William I. Johnson, we have been in touch with somebody,
Yeah.
right? But we haven't, again, it's gone, that
goes slow
trail is
sometimes.
going cold, so we pick it up again.
You had one more question?
Well, it can't wait, but I don't know how far the research has gone into, some of the soldiers that are buried there, but if there were any African Americans who had fought for the Confederacy under duress or whatever inspiration or motivation that may be buried there.
So that's a controversial thing. One of the controversies was that there was someone familiar with the cemetery who was claiming that there were African American Confederates buried there.
No, not at Easton, but at Oakwood.
At Oakwood, sorry, but we've found no evidence of that. And then, of course, the whole notion of African American Confederate soldiers is just a political balloon, because most of African Americans who were in Confederate service were enslaved people who were forced to be where they were doing what they were doing.
True, but I was doing a project on Lewis Parkway, and at Pine Spur Recreation Area, which was originally, in fact, before sort of desegregation, was designated to be an African American recreation area. Across the parkway from that is Easton Cemetery, where there's a man named Humphrey Claypool who's buried there. There's a CSA headstone, and I'm just wondering, because the 1912 law, I wonder if that was what opened up pensions to Confederate soldiers, because the opening of pensions to Confederate soldiers is a different thing, but you'll also find that the Sons of Confederate Veterans will claim a particular enslaved person and then claim that person was a soldier. And there have been families, African American families, some have gone along with it, others have contested it. So, and I'm
because the SCV has placed headstones.
Yes, they placed headstones.
Confederate veterans headstones at African American grave sites, and
often without the
there was
permission of the
I think it
family.
was in Roanoke a few years back, and the family had it removed.
And then,
but there's another one in Lexington, Virginia.
In Lexington, Virginia,
And again, there's some. It's not clear in what capacity he served.
yes, sir.
Have you been able to learn anything about when your great-grandfather was mustered out in Texas, about his journey back to Richmond and what that journey was like and why he came back to Richmond?
Yes and no. So we knew nothing, and then Erin and I were traveling through the South a couple of weeks ago, and we were going to swing home through Kentucky, and we thought, well, gosh, Matt Palmer's unit was organized at Camp Nelson, Kentucky, so why don't we go there? So I called up, and I asked, hey, do you have any records or anything? And they said, well, not really, but you might want to call the Kentucky Military History Museum. We did. We showed up. They didn't have much, but they did have the muster out rolls, and they had a historian who could hypothetically reconstruct how that journey might have happened. We don't have the actual evidence of that, but
well, we also didn't know whether he go back to, did he go to Kentucky? Did he come here? Would he have traveled up the river? Did he? But I mean, this historian was pretty certain that he wouldn't. That he wouldn't have gone to Kentucky because he didn't enroll and he didn't enlist in Kentucky. He would have gone back to Virginia. They would have sent him back. They gave you money and said, "All right, you're on your own now." So he had to make his way back somehow, and they pretty certainly on the trains. This historian thought, right?
So like
through New Orleans, so to take a sail to New Orleans and then take the train somehow back to Richmond. And he was in Richmond for a few years and then made his way to York County, which is where he settled in this community that has since been displaced called Magruder. There was a constellation of communities that was displaced by the U.S. government in 1942 to build Camp Perry. But it was that community had emerged from the contraband camps on the peninsula and from other settlements.
So in addition to Ancestry.com, we spend a lot of time on chronicling America, the Library of Congress database of American newspapers, trying to find information on soldiers or units that might have taken that route, because our historian in Kentucky said, well, it might have been New Orleans, and then he probably would have wound his way up to Charlotte or something. So just trying to find anybody else who might have taken that route to fill out the story. We have so much work still to do, but
But that was a big clue because we thought
it was huge.
We thought maybe he would have gone there.
Another question based on two things that you said. Were USCT soldiers buried in the national cemeteries that cropped up around all the major battlefields?
Yes. And actually, I mean, in the National Battlefield of Richmond, is it on Williamsburg Road, right?
There's one there,
Road.
but they're all over.
Yeah, but there are quite a few USCT there. I think I made a list.
Yeah.
Because those records are available online, yes.
I asked that
And they weren't
question-
segregated, it doesn't seem, at that point. So they were mixed in, because there are, the one in Alexandria, I thought it seemed like there was sort of a separate
I would
section,
think that some of the Jim Crow laws would have interfered
Right.
with that at some point in time.
Yeah.
But I'm glad to hear there are.
they kind of did when there was local control of the cemetery, like Oakwood. but I think, as Erin, I mean, Anna, maybe you can shed some, like, national cemetery versus local. We'll talk. Yeah.
But Henry Williams, for instance,
Yeah.
buried in East End, in his files, again, his sister-in-law saying that something was, like, his pension certificate had been just misplaced or something wasn't in order, and so they wouldn't accept him at the National Cemetery. So that's why she ended up having to pay for his burial in East End. Yeah.
I was wondering, following on from the talk about Magruder, whether your look through the death records for East End and Evergreen has given you much of a sense of where people in Richmond were most often living, the sort of freedmen's camps. Because I know there was one at Chimborazo Park where we excavated a couple years ago.
Right.
There's another one back by Brook Road. There's another one called Ziontown. Did you find a bunch of them showing up over and over again, or did you not get much of that kind of thing?
I haven't. I would love to, but we haven't established that part. Most of our research on East End and Evergreen are people who, they probably were born in the 1870s, so post-war. I mean, there are people who were formerly enslaved buried at the cemeteries, but mostly a bit later. So, I mean, we always talk about freedom's first generation, right? This was Robert F. Ames, a historian, who described that generation, both people who had been born into slavery and emancipated themselves, or their children and grandchildren, right? Those people born during Reconstruction and the decades following the war. So it's mostly that, so we haven't gone back. I'd love to,
Yes, we have to talk to you about
yeah.
So you mentioned with one of the men that in the records that you got, there was reference to a section in East End.
Yes.
Do you come across that often? Like, is there the possibility of being able to create a map of sections of these cemeteries?
That was the only one I think that I've seen, I've never seen any indication on a death certificate or any other records that I've found. It was just, I think it said section 9, and we thought, where's section 9? But what's interesting is in the same document, his name at birth was James Henry Ferguson, and he's buried apparently alongside his brother, who was William Ferguson. And there is in fact a plot for William Ferguson at Evergreen, or at East End, that's uncovered. There's no headstone for Mr. Ferguson, but often we think the name on the plot still might have stood in for a headstone. So we think he's probably there, but section 9. Yes, all right.
This happens to be the last question.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, can we have two more? Okay, yes.
You've done so much work. How and where did you get started? What was the first step, and what got you involved in it?
Hold that question, because, yes, sir.
I was wondering, do you anticipate either at East End or anywhere to find burial sites for African American officers who were in the USCT?
There weren't a tremendous number of African
No, there weren't.
officers, right? There were chaplains, but that could very well be if we have like tens of thousands of people buried there. That could very well happen. This all started in 2011 when Erin found a picture of 9 old black people, including my dad, standing behind Matt Palmer's headstone. So it was a picture from 1990. Erin's, I saw the picture and I knew immediately where they were because my dad had been talking forever when I was a kid about being thrown out of Magruder, but I also knew that they were at Camp Perry. So at the time I was doing a lot of military stories and various things, and I wanted to go to Camp Perry. It was that much about history and that much about macho bullshit.
But that led us eventually to East End and Evergreen.
Yeah.
It was originally kind of to shoot footage, because we weren't allowed to film on Camp Perry anymore, and so. But as soon as the first day we went out to East End, there was a group of Boy Scouts volunteering with John and other volunteers. And I started, pulling vines, and from that moment on, it was just...
She was up.
Yeah.
It took me a little longer.
Anyway, that's...
Erin and Brian, that was amazing.
Thank you.
The American Civil War Museum is going to co-host a volunteer day with the Friends of East End Cemetery this coming Saturday. Brian and Erin, if anyone here would like to participate, what do they need to know?
What do they need to know? They need to know where to go.
Okay, they can go online, where to find that?
Yeah.
GPS 50 Evergreen Road.
You can go to our website,
Yeah, you can go to our website.
friendsofeaston.com. Yes, wear jeans or other, long
Long
pants,
pants,
long sleeves. It's
boots.
not a problem this time of year. But
No.
some people show up in shorts, in July.
And there was
It's
young
like, don't
people.
do that. Yeah.
And they have lawn tools?
We've got all the tools.
You have all the
We
tools?
have all the tools that you'll need, yes. So all the tools are provided. We'll have water. We'll probably have some snacks.
I want to thank the camel. I want to thank Nate. I want to thank Eric. I want to thank Georgia. So please help me thank them.
Thank you.